It's almost unbelievable how humans can live in the same city, the same street, and see two completely different worlds unfold at the same time and somehow think it's normal. On one hand, you've got acres of perfectly manicured grass, fountains, clubhouses, and people dressed in brightly colored polos chasing a tiny ball across a course that costs more than most people make in a month. On the other hand, just a few blocks away, or sometimes just a block away, people are huddled in doorways, wrapped in blankets, trying to stay warm, trying to stay alive, trying to convince themselves that life hasn't completely abandoned them. And what's our collective response? We build more fairways, more sand traps, more luxury. We trim the grass to perfection, line up the flags, and act like that's all we need to feel civilized. The absurdity of it isn't just shocking, it's breathtaking. We've created a world where a single green, a single golf course represents the pinnacle of achievement and leisure, while basic human survival remains a gamble of chance and charity, and we justify it so easily. People like to play golf, we say. It's tradition, it's a sport. Meanwhile, the people who don't even have a roof over their heads are somehow invisible, like they're background noise to the soundtrack of our polished, privileged lives. And here's the kicker: everyone sees it. Everyone knows it's unfair. Everyone knows it's absurd. But somehow society collectively shrugs and keeps the fairways green. And the truth is, this contrast isn't new. It's baked into the way we measure value and worth. Luxury gets celebrated. Wealth gets admired. And those who struggle simply exist quietly. They're tolerated, ignored, and sometimes criminalized. It's as if the better we make the grass look, the more we convince ourselves that society is functioning properly. There's a surreal logic at work. The more people pay to chase balls on perfect turf, the less we have to look at the people whose lives aren't even being allowed to germinate. And it's not just about economics. It's about priorities and morality. Every acre of a golf course could be an acre of opportunity for someone to find shelter, to find safety, to find a small measure of dignity. Every dollar spent on a tournament, a membership, a green fee, could go toward food, health care, mental health services, or permanent housing. And yet we don't. Instead, we cultivate leisure as a monument to success, and we cultivate neglect as the cost of that success. And we don't even feel bad about it because it's hidden behind a veneer of normalcy and entertainment. What's even more striking is how society uses the absurdity to normalize itself. We've trained ourselves to accept these contrasts without questioning them. We smile at the golfers. We admire their swings. We talk about birdies and buggies, and in the same breath, we walk past someone shivering under a blanket and think, well, that's unfortunate. That little shrug, that tiny moment of disengagement is where complicity lies. It's subtle, almost invisible, but it's everywhere. And that's the brilliance of it, if you can call it that. The system keeps functioning because people have perfected the art of ignoring what's uncomfortable while celebrating what's convenient. And yet, there's a strange poetic element to it. Because when you step back and really look, the contrast becomes undeniable, impossible to ignore. It's a visual punchline, a societal joke that nobody is laughing at, but everyone recognizes. We've created a landscape that screams priorities. The green, lush fields for a few, and the cold, gray concrete for many. And if you're willing to notice, to really notice, it's almost impossible not to feel something. Rage, sadness, disbelief, or maybe a mix of all three. And that's where the opportunity lies. Because noticing the absurdity doesn't just make you angry. It wakes you up. It reminds you that the world we live in isn't inevitable. It's made. It's built with decisions and priorities, budgets and policies. And those things can be changed. The very same energy and resources that create playgrounds for privilege could be redirected towards survival for humanity. It doesn't require magic. It requires will. It requires courage. It requires refusing to accept the absurd as normal. And the more you dwell on it, the more the absurdity becomes a call to action. The manicured lawns become a mirror, reflecting back our values, our choices, our collective failures. And you realize that being aware of the contrast is the first step. Seeing it, naming it, acknowledging it. That's the spark that sets anything in motion. Because until someone notices that we have acres of golf courses and blocks of homelessness existing side by side, nothing changes. Awareness precedes action. Observation precedes justice. Recognition precedes empathy. And here's the unvarnished truth. The absurdity doesn't shame the system. It shames us. It shames us for our complacency, for our rationalizations, for our willingness to accept comfort for a few while ignoring suffering for many. The system doesn't need to change because it's working exactly as designed. It's built to protect the privileged, to entertain them, to keep them blissfully unaware of the disparity. The discomfort belongs to the observer, to the person who can see both worlds and knows that one is being ignored for the other. And that discomfort is valuable. It's the thing that can't be dismissed because it keeps nudging you toward thought, toward awareness, toward accountability. And once you can see it, you can't unsee it. Once you notice that acres of green aren't just aesthetic choices, but moral choices, you begin to question everything else you've been trained to accept without thought. Why are we investing in spectacle instead of survival? Why are we celebrating leisure while basic dignity is denied? Why do we allow inequality to masquerade as inevitability? These questions are uncomfortable, yes, but they are also liberating. They give you clarity. They give you perspective. They give you the moral lens to start demanding more of yourself and more of your world. And that's why noticing the absurdity of wealth and poverty side by side is more than just a critique. It's a call to consciousness. It's a reminder that society's priorities are not set in stone, that the resources we have are choices, and that we don't have to accept what is merely convenient over what is right. It's a reminder that humanity's capacity for compassion, for empathy, for fairness is always larger than the systems that seem immovable. Because if we can imagine a golf course, we can imagine a city where no one goes hungry or sleeps in the cold. If we can spend millions on leisure, we can spend millions on life. The absurdity is glaring, yes, but it's also a guidepost, a marker pointing toward what's possible when we stop treating the luxurious and the marginalized as separate, when we start seeing them as a single moral universe, bound together by the same responsibility. And that responsibility begins with seeing the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. It begins with refusing to accept the absurdity as normal. It begins with noticing that luxury and deprivation are not just coexisting, they are chosen. And once you notice that, everything changes. Because seeing the absurdity of our priorities isn't cynicism, it's clarity. And clarity is the first step toward justice. It's remarkable how society has perfected the art of looking away. We walk past suffering every single day and tell ourselves it's someone else's problem. We normalize injustice so skillfully that it barely registers as unusual anymore. We see a man sleeping under a thin blanket on a cold sidewalk, and instead of feeling the weight of the situation, we feel the weight of our own discomfort. It's easier to shuffle along, to distract ourselves with our phones, with meetings, with the endless trivialities that fill our schedules. And somewhere along the way, we've become experts at pretending that blindness counts as virtue. We've cultivated a culture where indifference is not just acceptable, it's encouraged. We call it moving on, focusing on our own lives, or keeping things in perspective. And yet, beneath those phrases lies a quiet abdication of responsibility. When we choose not to see, we're not neutral observers. We are active participants in the continuation of inequity. Complacency is not harmless. It's deliberate. Every time we shrug at a problem, instead of acknowledging it, we give it more room to grow. Every time we smile politely and walk past, we reinforce a system that rewards ignoring suffering while celebrating comfort and privilege. And it's subtle, too subtle for most people to notice. Society has perfected the mechanisms of avoidance, the charity events that make us feel generous without disrupting our routines, the news segments that show suffering in 30-second sound bites, and then move on, the urban planning that hides homelessness from view while prioritizing aesthetics for the wealthy. We've created layers of distraction that allow us to live as if the contrast between luxury and deprivation doesn't exist. And the more we perfect these distractions, the less we have to confront the real question: why are we letting it happen at all? It's ironic, isn't it? We pride ourselves on empathy, on moral awareness, on caring about justice. And yet the truth is that most of us are experts at selective attention. We notice suffering when it is convenient or palatable, but the moment it demands real discomfort, real action, we instinctively look away. It's in our nature, perhaps, but it's also a choice. Choosing to avert our eyes may feel safer, easier, or even sophisticated, but it comes at a cost. It costs us integrity, it costs us clarity, and it costs us the chance to truly live in alignment with our values. And the impact of this blindness goes beyond individual conscience. When society collectively refuses to acknowledge the suffering it perpetuates, systems become self-sustaining. Inequality continues, poverty is reinforced, and the absurdities of luxury coexisting with deprivation are normalized. When we accept that a golf course for the privileged exists while someone freezes just blocks away, we aren't witnessing reality. We're complicit in a carefully curated illusion. The illusion is that the world is orderly, that leisure is a human right while survival is merely circumstantial, and that fairness is naturally allocated by chance rather than human decision. And the subtlety is dangerous because it creates the illusion of neutrality. People often tell themselves, I can't fix the problem alone. I'm just one person. But indifference multiplied by millions becomes policy, becomes habit, becomes culture. Every ignored complaint, every avoided conversation, every moment we turn our heads is a small cog in a massive machine that keeps injustice rolling along. The comfort of passivity is seductive, and yet it is the very thing that perpetuates inequality. And humor doesn't make it disappear either. We joke about it. We ridicule the extremes. We make memes. We laugh at the contradictions of a world that funds luxury while neglecting survival. And yet the laughter, as cathartic as it may be, often masks discomfort instead of resolving it. Humor becomes a coping mechanism, a shield, a way of surviving without intervening. And there's a kind of brilliance to it because it's socially acceptable and socially safe, and it allows us to point at absurdity without touching it. But touching it, confronting it, that's where change starts. The truth is that blindness and complacency are habits that can be unlearned, but it takes conscious effort. It requires noticing the discomfort that avoidance creates, sitting with it instead of running from it, and then asking yourself what can actually be done. The first step is simple, but profound eye, seeing clearly, without flinching. Seeing not just the surface, the noise, the spectacle, but the consequences of ignoring the truth. Seeing the humanity that exists beyond convenience and comfort. seeing the impact of an action. Once you start noticing, the absurdity hits you differently. You realize that when society is allowed to look away, the gap between comfort and deprivation widens every single day. You see the luxury of a green golf course juxtaposed with the desperation of someone sleeping nearby, and suddenly the world stops feeling neutral. Suddenly choice, priorities, and morality come into focus. Suddenly, the question isn't just why it exists, it's why we allow it to exist. And the realization is uncomfortable because it forces self-reflection. It forces responsibility. It forces engagement. And that discomfort is exactly what makes awareness powerful. Because once you're aware, you can't unknow. You can't go back to the pleasant fiction of a world where privilege and suffering exist separately. You're confronted with the reality that every decision, every allocation of resources, every system is influenced by human choice, and that human choice is never neutral. And when you recognize that, you also recognize possibility. Possibility for change, for intervention, for action. But action requires rejecting complacency. It requires acknowledging that discomfort is not just inevitable, it's necessary. It requires facing the truth that in a society that has perfected the art of looking away, awareness itself becomes radical. Just noticing, just speaking, just refusing to ignore is a rebellion against the inertia of indifference. And the more people participate in that rebellion, the stronger it becomes. The more collective awareness grows, the more pressure builds on systems that perpetuate inequity. And it's not about guilt. It's not about shame. It's about clarity. It's about refusing to let the absurdity of human priorities become normalized. It's about refusing to pretend that a world that funds leisure for the few and neglect for the many is acceptable, inevitable, or sustainable. It's about understanding that blindness is a choice, and that choice can be changed. Awareness is the precursor to empathy, and empathy is the precursor to action. You can't fix a problem you don't see. And you can't see a problem if you've trained yourself to ignore it. That's why noticing, really noticing, is the most important step. And once you've noticed, you can't walk away. Not really. Not without carrying the knowledge, the responsibility, the moral obligation to do something. And that is where transformation begins. Because society's blindness and complacency aren't natural. They're cultivated. They're taught. They're reinforced. And if they can be taught, they can be unlearned. And the first lesson to unlearn is that looking away is acceptable. The first lesson to unlearn is that comfort is more important than conscience. The first lesson to unlearn is that ignoring reality protects anyone but yourself. Because once you stop looking away, once you stop excusing inaction, once you refuse to let complacency dictate what you notice or ignore, you start seeing the world as it truly is. And that vision is the foundation of change. And once you see it, you can't not act. Change doesn't start with anger. It doesn't start with outrage. Although those feelings are natural and they can be powerful catalysts, change starts with awareness. The quiet recognition that what we are seeing, what we are participating in, and what we have normalized is not right. And once awareness settles in, once you can look at a green golf course, sitting on acres of land while someone sleeps in the cold just blocks away, and not turn away, something inside you shifts. That shift is subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it grows, and it's the seed of responsibility, the beginning of action. Awareness makes you uncomfortable, but that discomfort is necessary. It's the feeling that tells you you can no longer be a passive observer in a world that asks you to look away. Once awareness is present, the natural next step is reflection. Reflection isn't enough on its own, but it's vital because it allows you to see not just the problem, but the patterns that created it. You begin to understand how systems perpetuate themselves, how resources are allocated, and how indifference becomes a cultural norm. You begin to see that this isn't a one-off tragedy, it's a cycle. Luxury and comfort are valued above survival. Entertainment and leisure are prioritized over human dignity. And you realize that while this system feels immovable, it's built from decisions that can be changed, and that responsibility lies with all of us, individually and collectively. From awareness and reflection comes the realization that action, however small, is necessary. It doesn't have to be heroic or monumental at first. It can be as simple as noticing the disparity, telling the truth about it, questioning priorities, or refusing to participate in the normalization of absurdity. Small actions accumulate. Small refusals to look away, small efforts to redirect resources, small acts of advocacy and voice create ripples. They show others that someone is paying attention, that someone is refusing to accept injustice as inevitable, and that someone believes that a difference can be made. And when action begins, it often feels messy, uncomfortable, and frustrating. Change rarely comes neatly packaged. It demands persistence, creativity, and resilience. It demands courage to speak up in situations where others remain silent. It demands challenging the status quo, even when that status quo feels reinforced by tradition, culture, or convenience. But the beauty of it is that every step, every effort, transforms not just the world around you, but also the person taking the step. Awareness plus action creates agency. It turns helpless observation into empowered participation. Action also requires empathy, because awareness without empathy can easily become anger without purpose. You can see injustice and feel rage, but if that rage isn't grounded in the understanding of human suffering, it risks alienating rather than mobilizing. Empathy allows action to be directed with intention to be both strategic and compassionate. It ensures that when you speak, advocate, or intervene, your efforts are aligned with the well-being of those affected, rather than just satisfying your own moral indignation. Empathy transforms responsibility into service, and service into sustainable change. And here's the crucial part: action is not about perfection. You will stumble. You will fail. You will face resistance. You will encounter indifference and sometimes hostility. But the alternative is far worse: doing nothing, turning away, and pretending that someone else's suffering isn't your responsibility. The world doesn't change for those who wait for perfect conditions. The world changes for those who are willing to start, however imperfectly, wherever they are, with whatever they have. Momentum is born from participation, not passivity. As action takes root, awareness deepens. You notice other inequities, other absurdities, other places where humanity has chosen spectacle over survival, amusement over dignity, convenience over morality. You begin to see that nothing exists in isolation. The problem of a golf course for the privileged next to homelessness is connected to broader societal patterns: wealth inequality, policy priorities, cultural indifference. And seeing those connections gives you a sense of power, because understanding how things work is the first step in changing them. Systems may be complicated, but systems are not infinite. They are designed, maintained, and therefore can be redesigned. At this stage, you start realizing that change is not just about correcting a single absurdity. It's about shifting priorities at every level. It's about asking why we celebrate leisure at the expense of survival, why we fund excess while denying basic needs, why we allow inequality to masquerade as normal. It's about building a culture where awareness is rewarded, where responsibility is expected, and where action is not extraordinary but ordinary. And each time you act, each time you speak, each time you refuse to ignore, you contribute to that cultural shift. And perhaps most importantly, action teaches resilience. It teaches patience, persistence, and the value of small victories. One policy change, one successful advocacy, one act of generosity or intervention reminds you that even in the face of systemic absurdity, progress is possible. It builds the confidence and fortitude to continue to tackle larger challenges and to inspire others to join in. Action is contagious. When people see that someone refuses to look away and is willing to do something about it, they are often moved to do the same. And that's how collective momentum begins. Action also fosters clarity of purpose. When you commit to doing something meaningful, you stop being distracted by superficialities. The absurdities of privilege and neglect become points of focus, not sources of despair. You begin to distinguish between what matters and what doesn't, between what is urgent and what is trivial. This clarity sharpens decision making, strengthens resolve, and allows you to channel energy into areas where it can have real impact. And then over time, action produces change. Not overnight, not perfectly, but inevitably. Policies shift, communities respond, awareness spreads, and slowly the absurdities that once seemed insurmountable start to diminish. Green lawns can coexist with human dignity only if society is willing to prioritize differently, to redirect attention and resources, to challenge old assumptions. That shift begins the moment someone refuses to ignore what is happening right in front of them. Ultimately, the journey from awareness to action is transformative, not just for the world, but for the individual. You stop being a passive witness to absurdity and become a participant in justice. You reclaim the part of yourself that thought comfort was more important than conscience. You discover that morality, courage, and responsibility are not abstract ideals. They are lived experiences expressed through noticing, reflecting, and acting. You see that you are not powerless, and that even small steps matter. Because when awareness leads to action, absurdity loses its power. Ignorance loses its comfort. Injustice loses its invisibility. And one by one, choices that once seemed immovable begin to shift. And that is the essence of meaningful change. Seeing clearly, refusing to look away, and taking responsibility for a world that belongs to all of us. Because action is the antidote to absurdity, and the moment we refuse to ignore the world as it is, we begin to create it as it should be.